Hello again. Good afternoon. Many thanks to our friends, colleagues being present this afternoon. Many thanks to ELIAMEP for inviting me to moderate this panel. And I mean, this is not only a very topical conference to discuss the Lausanne Treaty. The program is amazingly interesting, and I am glad that so many good experts are gathered around this conference for 2 days to discuss a topic that is old, but also still very lively. So, I'm really happy also to being invited to moderate a panel with excellent experts on the topic. And I look forward to your comments. How the role of the three protagonists influenced the course of the negotiations, how their personalities impacted the outcome of the convention in Lausanne, what conclusion in general we can draw about the role of personalities in such meetings. And having served for many years at an international organization, I can say that the role of personalities is very important for the outcome of a negotiation. Yeah, okay. So you can have a very good lawyer or professor or diplomat, but negotiation is something different. It has many elements that play. We have among us very prominent diplomats, both from Greece and Turkey, and I think they know what I'm talking about, especially at the table of the council meeting at NATO, Mr. Ambassador. So, I would start with you, Jonathan, then we go to Professor Mavrogordatos, and then to Ozan. Jonathan Conlin is Professor of Modern History at the University of Southampton and co-founder of the Lausanne project. But what impressed me when I saw his CV is that he is a prolific writer on many areas. I mean, he is not exclusively on one domain, and he is spread to many domains, some more exciting than international relations, I would say, like museum history, British art, cultural history, and so on. So, to prepare myself for this meeting, since I am between two, very prominent personalities, I took refuge to Harold Nicholson to contact. And there at the book The Last Phase, 1919-1925, a study in post-war diplomacy, he starts his description of Curzon with Plato's Republic. And he says, allow me to, of course, not to translate in a Greek university Plato, πόθεν άμα πράον και μεγαλόφημον ήθος ευρύσομεν, ενάντια γάρ που θυμοειδή πραΐα φύσης. Of course, Nicholson admired Curzon, for sure. And his book, as the previous ones, is proof of his admiration and eloge to his diplomatic and political skills. Curzon also worked after the end of the war to strategy that could have prevented the catastrophe, but he was not. I'm referring to the memoranda, the 3 memoranda that he submitted to the cabinet, and they were not endorsed. So, on this note, please, Jonathan, I give you the floor for your presentation. Thank you.
I should begin with some explanation about my title, Who or What is Tishy Curzon? This is a reference to a cartoon that appeared in the Daily Mail over the course of February, I imagine, 1923, the point at which Curzon sort of flounces off, leaving Lausanne never to return, having failed to bounce Ismet Pasha into signing a treaty which language of which he had not really had fully time to digest. It was really the sense of having come so close, having rolled the dice and having failed, despite having been seen as, from the beginning, as someone so much more authoritative, so much more experienced and physically more demanding, more grand in every sense, both physically, that in the sense of the expectations that were on Curzon's shoulders, there really was a sense that Lausanne should have been a cakewalk for him. It should have been very easy for him. And so Tishy was a fictional racehorse, which Thomas Webster, the cartoonist for the Daily Mail, which is still is the most popular working class newspaper or lower middle class newspaper in Britain, created this horse that apparently never won a race because it always crossed its legs, as you can see here at the starting post. So here you have a sense that Tishy, as the horse that always fails, has been given Curzon's face, and Curzon has failed to jump a 6-inch fence. So in other words, the idea, he could have stepped over that fence. It's a really easy to achieve peace at Lausanne on terms that would have been seen as a victory for Britain, and yet somehow he balked, somehow he failed, and you can see Lausanne is the jockey that has been thrown, projected over the horse's head. Now, it certainly was true, and this is a wonderful memorandum which Curzon, in his inimitable way, has written his C over it to show every time he read a memorandum he would write C, usually in a blue pencil. And here you can see a note from Horace Rumbold from November 1922, at the very beginning of Lausanne, in which Horace Rumbold, who ended up replacing Curzon at the head of the British delegation after Curzon flounced off in February, and there was the hiatus until April 24th, 1923, when talks resumed, Horace Rumbold writes that Ismet Pasha is not at all à la hauteur of his task. There is not a single really big, experienced and capable man in the Turkish delegation. So there really was a sense that not only was Ismet Pasha seen as an experienced diplomat, he's obviously a talented general, but he was, as he himself admitted, not used to the savoir-faire of diplomatic speech. And certainly in the eyes of Stroop, who was the cartoonist for the Daily Express, Ismet was seen as the stooge of the Russians. Here you see him as a puppet on Russia's knee, just banging away, saying no, no, no. Reminded here of Curzon's remark that Ismet sounded like a broken record, endlessly repeating the same arguments over sovereignty and sovereignty and sovereignty. Indeed, Curzon himself says at one point that Chicherin and Ismet sounded so similar that Chicherin sounded like a cowpack of Ismet. It has to be said, though, that Curzon was under an awful lot of pressure in that he wasn't just standing in for British interests, he was also there seen as someone to defend the interests of the British Empire, and Britain still seeing itself at that point as the world's #1 Muslim power, a phrase that, as we saw, Eleftherios Venizelos, a position he aspired to for Greece. He, in this memo, in this telegram, was being asked by a group of Egyptian students who at Lausanne were very present. Students there were many large numbers of communities of Egyptian students studying at Lausanne, Turkish students, all of which were very much involved in agitation and protesting at Lausanne during the protests. And here they are, in a sense, appealing to Curzon not to allow the Turks to, as it were, give away too much at the table. And obviously this feeds into some of that conspiracy theory we've already heard about from Ayhan Akhtar, about the idea that somehow there was a Jewish conspiracy to give away the caliphate. There's also the question for Curzon of maintaining British investment interests. It has to be said, though, that when it came to the Ottoman debt, there were relatively few British investors left holding Ottoman debt at this point. From the 1870s onwards, it had been the French who had been taking over more and more of the Banque Impériale Ottomane and were taking on more and more of those French rentiers were investing in Ottoman debt. So this was much more of a French issue. What the British were interested in was in other concessions, like the Turkish Petroleum Company, and I'll be coming back to oil because that's my particular area of interest, having written a biography of the great Ottoman Armenian Kalus Gulbenkian. But also the other concessions. Armstrong Vickers had a contract to build a military naval shipyard to build dreadnoughts for the Ottomans, perhaps the Turkish Navy. There was also the Entente Cordiale, and this was something that, in a sense, was becoming increasingly fictional. We know in the run-up to Lausanne that there were contestations, personal meetings between Raymond Poincaré, Curzon's not really opposite number, but the head of state in France, driving Curzon to the point of tears in exasperation, because the French had the view that they were ready for peace almost at any price with Turkey. They were not willing to stand shoulder to shoulder with Britain at the Chanak crisis in October 1922. And for Curzon, this was a source of profound disappointment and grief. And yet, it was still possible in Punch to find cartoons like this, in which Abdul Hamid is addressing the ghost of Abdul Hamid, is speaking to a young Turk saying, "I always managed to keep Britain and the great powers apart. You seem to have united them." There were also the factor of the Russians and, of course, the newly elected head of Italy, Benito Mussolini, who is here in a very creepy-looking photograph, I assume, taken in the Beau Rivage Hotel, where I had the privilege to be just a few days ago. Among the many other advantages that Curzon had, he was incredibly experienced as a diplomat. He was someone who'd been a viceroy of India. He traveled widely in the region, and he also saw himself as an expert on handling Orientals, as he would have patronizingly referred to them as. He also had the advantage in that the British Secret Service was reading all Ismet Pasha's cables back to Ankara, and that was an advantage that no one else had. And indeed, he was passing on some of the intercepted cables to the Swiss Sûreté, and the Swiss secret police archives in Lausanne are well worth a visit to anyone interested in Lausanne, because they were keeping files on all the official delegations, including the many unofficial delegations, like the two Egyptian ones, the Zagoulis Egyptian delegation, the nationalist Egyptian one, and all the Armenians as well. But here you can see that Benito Mussolini's concern was that Britain and France were sticking together, and that Entente Cordiale would continue to serve their own interests at the expense of everyone else. Final cartoon is here. This is a concern that, in a sense, Britain and France both had, that Greece and Turkey might go off on their own, as in a sense they did, in signing a separate bilateral treaty in January for the population exchange. But this was certainly a cause of concern. Indeed, in January, Eleftherios Venizelos proposes to Curzon that, why don't, as it's not going, as you Curzon don't seem to be getting very far, why don't Ismet and I just have our own treaty, not just on the population exchange, on everything, just between the two of us. And here again, in Curzon's distinctive handwriting, you can see he's said, "Do you propose that we shall sit here after our own failure to make a peace between Greece and Turkey? Someone else must do this, not I." So Curzon's saying, okay, if you're going to do this, I'm off. And in a sense, that's what happened. It's already been discussed how the paternity of the population exchange was one that many of those who did have their fingerprints on it sought to disavow. Curzon, I think it has to be said, has already been mentioned by Professor Afentouli, apologies. Curzon, I think, got the right end of the stick here, and as he pointed out in this very often quoted, and rightly so, comment from December, that this would be something that in 100 years' time, and here, George Nathaniel Curzon, if you're listening, we're here, and you were right for once. He detested having anything to do with it. And of course, it could have been said he could have done more to stop it. As I mentioned already, Tishy Curzon failed to jump over the fence in February the 4th, when the talks collapsed, and he famously went to the railway station in Lausanne, expecting ISMET to back down to sign the treaty. The departure of his train was repeatedly put off, various excuses were found, but in the end he did leave, and as the press said, amazing scenes were witnessed as the Italians and the Americans ran after ISMET trying to get him, in a sense, defeating, undermining Curzon's attempt to bluff by, in a sense, running after Curzon and trying to get him to agree. So the end result was the train, this is the Lausanne departure board from today, I hasten to add, not from back then, the train left, and as I say, Curzon had failed. In a sense, this was his big chance to achieve what he yet to achieve. He achieved very much in a long career, but he yet become Prime Minister. And I think he hoped that if he bounced ISMET into a treaty, he could have become Prime Minister. I now want to talk about oil just for a few minutes because it is something I'm very interested in. Oil was something that, as we've seen Ayhan Akhtar's talk, continues to be a source of many conspiracy theories. This is a lovely cartoon showing Hachivad and Karagos arguing over oil. The big oil behemoth of the day was, of course, Standard Oil, and the key backdrop to the oil question at Lausanne was the so-called oil war being fought, a peaceful war, an economic war, between British and American oil majors, in which oil companies were leaning on the State Department and the British Foreign Office to do what they wanted. And it's important to emphasize, I think at this conference we've spoken a lot about political leaders, what the President says, what the Minister says. I haven't heard much yet about what bankers say, about what the heads of multinational oil companies say, about what the head of NGOs say. I think we need to bear those things in mind. Here the Turks really threw a spanner in the works by confirming the Chester concession, which originally dated back to an American vice admiral called Chester, who acquired it in 1910, which gave vast concessions for railroads and oil across the whole of Anatolia. And this is confirmed by the National Assembly in the summer in 1923, which is seen as dividing the Allies insofar as the Americans and the Turks, the Americans encouraged the Turks to stand up to the British and the French to prevent them giving the oil concession or confirming the oil concession to Turkish Petroleum. In the case of the Americans, this involved a betrayal of their long Christian missionary commitment to the Armenians and to the Wilsonian Award of the Armenian National Home. It's already been mentioned that making peace under military pressure should not be done. It has to be said that at various points the Royal Navy, Curzon did have ships sent in to try and kind of put a bit of pressure on the Turks. This did not work. I think the key point to his failure was the fact that British public opinion at home was so tired of war by this point that it wanted peace at any price. In a sense, they were rather similar to Raymond Poincaré in that regard. The Daily Mail and Daily Express were controlled by the single press baron Lord Rothermere, and as you can see in this coverage here, he was very much pushing for peace. And so the end result, to quote Neville Henderson, was a sordid anticlimax, squabbling over money and the rights of capitalists, with an America fouled by oil in the background. And it was certainly perceived in Britain as a great defeat, a surprising defeat for Britain. In my last 2 minutes, I'd just like to shill a bit for the Lausanne project, which my co-founder, Ozavci, you'll be hearing from him shortly, and I put together. We are been around since 2017. Do please visit our website. We organize conferences. We recently published 2 months ago, They All Made Peace, What is Peace, which is came out of a conference we organized in Paris a few years ago. With the help of the University of Macedonia here in Greece, we're having another conference in Thessaloniki this November, which will produce another book. But we're also trying to make the expertise of experts like you accessible to non-experts by working with high school history teachers here in Greece and in Turkey as well. There's been a lot said about the role of Joel, as Professor Tsoukalis said, about the role of diplomats like His Excellency in bringing about peace. But there are other ways that we might think about that are complementary to achieve peace. And one of them, which we can hopefully do today, is to try and teach Lausanne better in both Greek and Turkish high school teachers. This summer, the Lausanne project will be bringing Turkish and Greek high school history teachers together in Lausanne to work together to come up with better ways of teaching Lausanne. We're also doing a graphic novel in which Karagiosis and Hachivat will go to Lausanne in 1923, And finally, if nothing else, do please follow our Lausanne diary on Twitter, where every day in Greek, Turkish, and English, you can find out news from that precise day in what was happening in Lausanne 100 years ago. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for covering, all the aspects of Kersen's personality, and also for mentioning how he achieved to save, I would say, the Turks from the Russian influence during the conference. I don't know if this is the case today, but we have to mention it nevertheless. And now I turn to one of the, maybe the most prominent expert of this period. Sorry,
I'm going to be.
Yeah. I mean, this is a general assumption throughout the years of Venizelos' impact and legacy to Greek politics. And especially for the younger generations that are present here today, I would make a reference to your book, Stillborn Republic, an excellent study of social conditions and party strategies in Greece, 1922 after the disaster, to 1936, and because I think I better quote Theotokos on Venizelos than offer my own quote. So Venizelos is still, I believe, the most popular politician of the Greek state. If we had to make a poll, I think that he is unparalleled. So how Theotokos describes him? Chief, savior, symbol of half of Greece, Satan to the other half. He was certainly for all the presidents of Greek affairs, the axis around which the nation was starting to wheel again. Nobody understood what exactly he had in mind, but his presence was enough to upset everything, as if this presence emitted some mysterious current, which shook all at once all the forces of the national organism, the forces of faith and heroism, of adventure and plunder, of creation and dissolution, of malice and envy. All the vital instincts which slept unused awake again and boiled forcefully on the rosy coast of the eastern Mediterranean. Venizelos, Venizelos. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I must note that this is George Theotokos from the novel Argo, because there was a Michael Theotokos who was the major collaborator of Venizelos at Lausanne. So at the beginning I thought you were talking about Mikhail Theotokos, from whom I have actually the first part of my title. Theotokos, Mikhail, regarded the success of Venizelos at Lausanne as his greatest diplomatic achievement. I must confess that I am I have been under a double limitation. Number one, as I was assigned this topic. I did not choose it. And actually hearing from what I heard today, I would have preferred to be on another panel. But I was assigned to this panel, and I had to obey. Second, I received a note that I only have 8 to 10 minutes, which was another surprise just 2 days ago. So I have tried to comply to this directive at the expense of a longer presentation. But I may add a few things, especially because of what I heard about the exchange of populations. In September 1922, for the utterly defeated country that was Greece, and for the military taking power under Colonel Nikolaos Plastiras, Eleftherios Venizelos was a providential deus ex machina, από μηχανής Θεός. There was absolutely no one else that could represent Greece with comparable international recognition, contacts, and accumulated experience in order to counteract the immediate consequences of defeat as effectively as he could. One only has to imagine others in his place, including those to be executed in November as responsible for the Asia Minor disaster. Imagine Gounaris, or Proto Papadakis, or Nikolaos Theotokis representing us at Lausanne. What are the specific implications of charismatic leadership for diplomacy and international relations? This is a rather unexplored topic that I examined in a graduate course some years ago, but did not pursue further. Actually, that was at Tufts. The appeal of Venizelos as a charismatic leader was no doubt limited to Greeks and some Philhellenes, especially British ones, especially Barrows, King's Scholars. Nevertheless, it is quite remarkable that Venizelos produced on foreign observers the most vivid and lasting impressions. 30 years later, Joseph Grew, American diplomat who had been an official observer at the Conference of Lausanne, had this to say after listing the various delegates of the various countries. But the outstanding personalities of the first phase of the conference were, in my opinion, Lord Curzon, Venizelos, Montagna, who was the second Italian delegate, and Ismet Pasha. He then describes in his article the antics of Venizelos, and nevertheless adds, whether we sympathized or not, we all listened when Venizelos spoke. He was a man who would command attention in any situation, and his free, self-confident, clear delivery was a blessed relief after the halting, indistinct speeches of some of the other delegates. The consequences of defeat became manifest most painfully when the great powers imposed on Greece the evacuation of eastern Thrace with the armistice of Moutania, which was presented to her as a fait accompli. Fully aware that he was objectively irreplaceable, Venizelos was in a position to blackmail the military regime by threatening to resign as representative of Greece if they did not accept immediately the decision of the great powers concerning Eastern Thrace. He even took the opportunity to say so in his very first speech at the Conference of Lausanne on 22nd of November 1922. He said, when he had been asked to represent his country at the peace conference, he had said that although he had retired from political life, he would undertake this mission, but only on condition that the Greek government accepted the grievous sacrifice of Eastern Thrace in compliance with the desires of the Allies. At the Conference of Lausanne, only Eleftherios Venizelos, with his commanding presence and consummate skill, could maneuver around a peculiarly contradictory situation. This was the final peace conference intended to terminate World War I with respect to Turkey, with a new peace treaty to replace the stillborn Treaty of Sevres. For the victorious great powers who convened the Lausanne Conference, Great Britain, France, and Italy, Turkey was still a country defeated in the war, as the Ottoman Empire, even if it had been victorious against Greece. For its part, Greece had been defeated by Turkey, but remained nonetheless an ally of the victorious powers. Only Venizelos could evoke persuasively this alliance, which had lapsed in the preceding years. Only he could revive it, as he did, with great success. Thanks to the support primarily of Great Britain, but also thanks to the friendly disposition of the two other great powers, France and Italy, he was able to achieve a lot at Lausanne. He managed to limit Greek losses. There were absolutely, essentially, no territorial losses for Greece. And he obtained eventually the best possible settlement, even turning the defeat into an opportunity with the exchange of populations that boosted the national homogeneity of the state. Here I will switch to the exchange of populations, about which inaccurate things have been said today. One of the greatest achievements of Venizelos at Lausanne was that he managed to have the convention on the Greek-Turkish convention on the exchange signed before the conference broke up on the 4th of February. I speculate that if the convention for the exchange of populations had been left hanging, Turkey might have changed its mind. Because, as we will see a bit later, the exchange was not, somebody said that Turkey was the first to accept it. No, ISMET was against it, spoke against it. It is wrong to assimilate the exchange of populations with ethnic cleansing or massive expulsion, although it has become the vogue, it has become even the title of books. This is completely misleading for three basic reasons. Number one, the exchange of populations was not a unilateral action like ethnic cleansing or expulsion. It was the result of negotiation, arduous negotiation, and final agreement, which was moreover supervised in its execution by the Mixed Commission. Second, the exchange itself did not kill or rape or maim anybody. On the contrary, it protected the life, the honor, and the bodily integrity of those who were exchanged. Number three, the exchange itself did not destroy and did not steal at least the immovable properties of those who were exchanged. On the contrary, it recognized and in principle kept their property rights. When I say the exchange itself, I mean, and I underline, that what the Greek populations of Turkey and the Turkish populations of Greece went through are not due to the convention of the exchange. They would have happened also without the convention, and very probably to a much larger scale and much more savagely, if you want. So all these misunderstanding about the convention, I think, is grounded. In Lausanne, Venizelos repeatedly spoke against the compulsory exchange. And he even spoke against it on the 27th of January 1923, only 3 days before the convention was signed. He said that we repeatedly, the Greek delegation repeatedly spoke against the compulsory exchange. Greece would be ready to forego the compulsory exchange if Turkey would accept the return of the Greeks who have already left. He says, even this last moment, I make this appeal, and the Greek delegation will be happy if our proposal can be accepted. Only if it is not accepted, then we will obey the necessity of signing the convention. Was Venizelos simply bluffing? It was very easy for Ismet to call the bluff of Venizelos simply by saying, promising, even promising vaguely, that Turkey would in the future allow the Greeks to return. He never said anything about this. And Venizelos throughout the month of December prodded him again and again. Ismet never uttered a word about the return of the Greeks who had left. So the compulsory exchange, both for Venizelos and for Nansen at the beginning, and for Curzon, the compulsory exchange was the result of the refusal of Turkey to accept, in principle, that the Greeks who had left would return. In the fall of 1922, Greece was the one who had an immediate need of an agreed compulsory exchange, not Turkey. For the most part, the Greeks had left Turkey, and Turkey refused to accept, they did not even discuss their return. Turkey could also count that on the rest of the Greek population leaving. On the contrary, in Greece, there was almost 500,000 Turks and other Muslims who could not be expelled without an agreed compulsory exchange, and therefore could not leave properties that could be used for the settlement of Greek refugees, which, as we know, was done to almost 50% in the rural sector. Which is why Ismet, on the 12th of December 1922, he presented the compulsory exchange as not in the interest of Turkey, because it would result in the impoverishment and expulsion from Greek territory of several 100,000 Turks. So the Turkish position uttered by Smith was that we don't even listen to your saying that the Greeks should return, but we're against the turning refugees of a few 100,000 Turks into refugees. And later, in 1929, Venizelos explained to a refugee committee that the Convention of Lausanne was not, in fact, in essence, a convention for the exchange of Greek and Muslim populations and properties, but a convention simply for the departure of the Muslim population from Greece. This about the population exchange, which I consider as the greatest success of Venizelos in Lausanne, precisely because Ismet did not want But in the end, Venizelos even established an unexpected rapport with his Turkish counterpart İsmet, laying the ground for Greek-Turkish friendship merely 7 years later. When the Lausanne Conference convened for its second phase in the spring of 1923, the only remaining issue between the two countries were the war reparations demanded by Turkey for the destruction caused by the Greek army and administration in Asia Minor. Contrary to the laws of war. Eventually, a compromise was found and became Article 59 of the Peace Treaty, whereby Greece recognized its obligation to pay reparations, but Turkey declined to demand payment. What clinched the agreement was the cession of the border town of Karagach to Turkey. This is how the final meeting on 26 May 1923 is remembered 30 years later by Drew, who had played a crucial role himself as an intermediary between Venizelos and İsmet. All this had lasted 2 hours, during which we were all under the greatest possible strain, and when it finally appeared that a solution was in sight, the psychology of human nature took its natural course, and the air of solemnity changed immediately into one bordering on actual hilarity. Diamandi, the Romanian, got up and insisted about Venizelos moving next to İsmet. The details of the settlement were then discussed in the most amicable way. Venizelos and İsmet, calling each other mon cher ami, had their hands on each other's arms already in 1923. The well-known picture is from 1930, but already they had started the tenderness already there. And Drew says they appeared to be on the point of actually embracing. Just before the end of the meeting, Venizelos, on behalf of İsmet and himself, thanked all those who had helped in reaching this happy solution, including the American observer, Drew, and we all got up and shook hands all round. And that's the end of the story. Thank you.
So let's turn now to our third speaker this time. Thank you for being with us virtually. Of course, we would prefer to be physically, but we understand that some other engagements kept you. You are in Utrecht actually now. So, also, I mean, a member of the Lausanne project. And a co-founder as well. All right, okay. And also with a very wide range of publications. So I admire, I mean, the competence, I mean, when it spreads on many domains. Well, İsmet Pasha, another intriguing personality in this negotiation. Mustafa Kemal's choice, he trusted him. He was the victor of the Mudanya, a tough negotiator, although as a soldier throughout his life he had no diplomatic experience. The aim at Lausanne was to add a diplomatic victory to the military one. İsmet Pasha made it clear that he was not representative of the defeated Ottoman Empire, but of a victorious Turkey, determined to discuss on equal footing. He often communicated directly with Mustafa Kemal, leaving the Prime Minister Raif Bey in isolation, thus deteriorating their relations. But nevertheless, İsmet Pasha secured the interests of the Turkish Republic. The centenary of the treaty coincides with the centenary of the state establishment by Afentouli. How will it be celebrated by today's steps? The treaty has been an issue of the political discussion for some years now, and many voices in Ankara request its revision, raising eyebrows not only in this country but in the international environment in general, among allies and members of NATO and the European Union, because this considers what we call a revision stance. And after Ukraine, I mean, revisionist politics is suspicious, at least, to some extent. So, please navigate us through the waters of the personality of Ismet Pasha.
So I'm going to begin my presentation first of all by thanking the organizers for their kind invitation. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to make it to Athens. I would very much like to be there and meet all of you in person. As has been mentioned, I'm one of the co-conveners and co-founders of the Lausanne project, which Jonathan Conlin, my colleague, has introduced earlier. At the very outset of my talk, I would like to share with you a personal note, if you like. In the 5 or 6 years I was involved in the Lausanne project, I've had the opportunity to read and edit several blog posts, record podcasts with several experts on different subjects revolving around Lausanne, and also author a graphic novel, as Jonathan just mentioned, which entails checking on a daily basis what happens in Lausanne. One of the things that the Lausanne project has taught me along the way is the fact that peacemaking is a complex process of give and take, setting priorities, bargaining for one's red lines, and also making sacrifices, not only of one's own interests, but at times of others as well, using them as bargaining. Peacemaking is an intersectoral and multisectoral process. And for us historians, I hope I don't sound like a bad preacher here, but for us historians, peacemaking entails teasing out the interconnections among geostrategic, political, economic, financial, legal, and cultural interests, as well as threat perceptions, not treating them as separate entities. It requires looking into non-state actors as much as government representatives, as Jonathan has just mentioned. In 1929, 1923, at the center of the complex peacemaking process in Lausanne was a figure who considered himself to be a symbol. The head of the Turkish delegation, Mustafa İsmet Pasha, that later adopted the surname İnönü. In my talk today, I will talk about İsmet Pasha and his diplomacy by using a very broad brush in my 10 minutes. I must note that I'm not a biographer of İsmet Pasha, and also for brevity, I will call him simply İsmet without meaning to offend anyone for not using titles. As a 38-year-old officer, İsmet was at the battlefront fighting the Turks' independence war as the commander of the Western Anatolian Army only 60 days before his arrival in Lausanne in November 1920. When he negotiated and signed the Veremis ceasefire in October, and as an officer, İsmet very well knew about war and ceasefires, but peacemaking was new to him. In his 1968 memoirs, the sketches of which, draft of which you can see on the screen now, İsmet recalls his sentiments of Lausanne when he found out his appointment as foreign minister and the head of Lausanne mission in 1922. With these words, I quote, "It was the first time in my life that I took off my boots and put on civilian shoes." Indeed, bar Mudanya, İsmet had no prior diplomatic experience. Prior a short visit to Germany and France in June 1914, he had not even been to Europe before, but he was conscious of his inadequate familiarity with the intricacies of international diplomacy. He was himself reluctant to take up any role in the Lausanne delegation in the first place. He would write in his memoirs that he did not know, I quote, much about diplomatic and civilian ways of doing things, and for a while I was incapable of making head or tail of these things, unquote. For instance, in the first days of the conference, when the Italian diplomat Panteion told him that Panteion wanted to submit his protests to ISMET about a matter, ISMET would respond that he did not know what this means. And then he went on to say that if Panteion submitted his protest, ISMET might inform an hour later that they would go to war with Italy and other allied powers. This Panteion would say surprise and then would show genuine interest and sympathy and ask ISMET why all of a sudden he would start talking about war. And ISMET would respond that he did not know about anything like protest and all the scope of diplomacy. All dedicated observers of the conference, such as the Hungarian artist in Hungary, ISMET looked like the antithesis of a diplomat. While workers employs the arrogance of a British aristocrat, can depict and write in his memoirs, while Curzon had this architectural rhetoric and great skill in diplomacy, ISMET looked like, I quote and unquote, toy soldier with his diminutive stature. While one came to Lausanne to salvage as much as possible from the Treaty of Serre, the other sought to tear it apart for me. For all this lack of experience and sophistication, ISMET learned the art of peacemaking at Lausanne the hard way. In November 1922, in his pocket were only some 30-line instructions that consisted of 14 articles. For him, and indeed for the Turkish nationalists in Ankara, peace meant addressing in their power the most important articles ISMET's instructions included. But I have also given an answer to the question asked earlier as to what this meant. I agree with one of the commentators. This meant different things to every single delegation at Lausanne that were formally given formal accreditation or not. So among the 14 articles of ISMET, there were certain deadlines, such as the issue of the Armenian national home in Eastern Anatolia. This was not to be permitted, such as the capitulations, they were to be abolished, or limitations on the Turkish army and navy, again not to be permitted, and the regime of foreigners in Turkey. All of these were linked to the sovereignty of the new country that Mustafa Kemal and his entourage looked to establish and safeguard. On these very topics, on this subject, if any concession was demanded on the part of the Allied powers, ISMET was asked to end the negotiations at whatever cost. On the other issues, such as the Syrian border, the Thrace border, Western Thrace, Ottoman Dykes, or the Straits, ISMET was asked to receive instructions from Ankara before terminating the talks if the negotiations went in a non-welcome direction. So did ISMET, the official diplomat set for Lausanne in November 1922, and from the very first day his inexperience showed. John has mentioned this, but I'm going to repeat again. All locals, such as Karen, noticed that at the very beginning, and how his main duels with Curzon would usually end in a monologue, with Curzon lingering the conversation with all his eloquence, and ISMET patiently waiting for his interlocutor in silence. You will see this happening time and time again. And it happened time and time again. When called by Curzon, ISMET would say that he would reply, quote, after consulting with his expert advisors, unquote. On one occasion, as another duel between the two turned into a monologue, Curzon would speak excruciatingly long, that at the very end, when he turned to Ismail and asked, well, what's your Excellency's opinion on the subject? Ismail would wake up all of a sudden and answer, no. So that's because Curzon's crystalline words were ricocheting against Ismail's head, as Karen would argue, or more should this be considered a forerunner of Russian mixed diplomacy, if not the Cold War. What was happening here actually was at least twofold. On the one hand, issues that constitute the red lines for the Turkish delegation were not able to be open to negotiation. More often than not, what Curzon or others said did not entirely matter to Ismail at that point, as long as the sovereignty of Turkey was undermined, or the channels for undermining it remained open, channels such as the capitulations, there was nothing more to be heard or said than no. Now that this conference's subtitle is Looking Back as well as Looking Ahead, I feel obliged to open a parenthesis here and note that, just like other delegations, the Turkish delegation also looked back in history at Lausanne quite often. A great deal of their policy was informed by a syndrome-driven past that would go back to at least late 18th century to the unfolding of the Eastern question, when the Near East became a playground for great power competition and cooperation, for coin imperialism and numerous armed legal, administrative, and financial intervention. The so-called Eastern question, or have to deal with the perceived relative weakness of the Ottoman Empire, occupied European minds as much as occupied Ottoman minds as much as European minds. As I argue in my last book, in Dangerous Gifts, it was first and foremost an Ottoman question, the Eastern question, and it left the Ottomans with deep-seated ontological insecurity, or an insecurity memory, with a syndrome that far precedes the Sarah syndrome of Turkey. At Lausanne, the instructions of the Ankara government, and especially the unconditional insistence on sovereignty, manifested this insecurity at every turn, though I must underscore that the very same insecurity also prompted ultra-nationalist and ultra-conservative sentiments that engendered mass violence in the wake of the Empire and has arguably shaped Turkish political culture ever since. Here I close the parenthesis and return back to Ismail's no diplomacy, which can as well read as sovereignty diplomacy or Turkey's Wilsonian moment, as Dave Winter has argued in his recent study. The second, more immediate context to this no diplomacy was more personal and more in line with the theme of his man. Having fought several battles in the past decade of his life, Ismail was deaf, though not as a canon, but considerably deaf. More often than not, he used his handicap to his advantage, as we all know. But the thing that I would like to underscore here is the fact that his deaf ears fell not only the well-known figures like Lord Curzon or Veremis, the other figures that were introduced at this panel, but also several other delegates at Lausanne that were not given formal reputation, that were not allowed to get their voices heard, or that were simply silent. Arabs, Armenians, Kurds, whatever. For the Arab world, for instance, especially for Syria and Palestine, Lausanne was the last hop for reviving their democratic parliament that had been abolished by the French mandate and military dictatorship in 1920. On the 4th of February 1923, the day the negotiations at Lausanne wrote, Ismail did hear for a moment the Arab voices presented by figures like the Lebanese Sheikh Arslan, Egyptian Ahmed Lutfi Al-Said, the Russian Minister of Defense Jafar Pasha al-Askari, and the Indian revolutionary Mavrogordatos Ozan. These figures were trying to make an intervention for mounts gathering at Hotel Cecil. And 9 days later, on the 9th of February 1923, the Ankara government did recognize the independence of Hijaz, Syria, Palestine, and Iraq, and the United Turk-Arab Front was formed. This did intimidate French and British interests and led them to hold back, especially on the issue of the capitulations eventually. Thus we arrived at April 1923, when the negotiations began again, and the capitulations were, it was agreed that the capitulations would be abolished. The pro-Arab protest would fall on Ismet's deaf ears one more time. Ismet dropped the Arab cause from his agenda for Turkey's greater ones, and the Arab world remained under a new imperial mandate. So Lausanne did not mark the end of empire as we like to believe, or as the mainstream narrative goes, but it re-imperialized the Near East. And it was, the case of the Arabs was only one instance of give and take, of making sacrifices, of interest, and not only of one's own, but also others, using them as bargaining chip. This making at Lausanne was a complex process of many of these stories, some of which Jonathan and I, as editors and our contributors, discussed in our new edited volume. They all make these, what is peace. But it was not only, the question here is not only about what peace meant, but also what peace brought about. And I believe that it was a new imperial order in the Near East. Unfortunately, I can't be there to have a small chat with you in the coffee break, but should you have any questions coming from my presentation, please do email me and I will be happy to further the conversation with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much as well. Thank you all for this very, very good narratives on the three protagonists. I don't know if there are any questions. Of course, we run out of time. And okay, we have a video by Professor Veremis, who unfortunately cannot be with us today, so we will project the video, and then I take the liberty to break the session for a short break. Okay, thank you.
The Treaty of Lausanne is the beginning of a new era, both for Turkey, which becomes a new nation state at that point, and Greece, which is now much diminished after the war with the Ottoman Empire. So we must pay special attention to the provisions of the Treaty of Lausanne, and I would add, and this is my contribution, to the people who made it possible. There are many clashes, many problems between the leaders of the British committee, in other words, between Lord Curzon, who was the foreign minister of the United Kingdom of Britain, and Raymond Poincaré, the French prime minister at the time, who had entirely different ideas as to what part of the Ottoman Empire should belong to whom. The French believed that a good part of the Ottoman Empire should be part of their own attention, and the British, of course, thought otherwise. I think the French were really, and Poincaré especially, responsible for giving up eastern Thrace to the Turkish victors of the war. In other words, both the French and the Italians gave their preference to the Ottoman side of the argument, whereas the British believed that some of what was given away should have remained as it were. The two characters, Lord Curzon and Raymond Poincaré, were extremely different people, very different, on very two sides of the human constitution. Poincaré was very much a nationalist of the French variety. He believed that France had been wronged by the great powers and should be given more territory than all the others, whereas the British, with Lord Curzon ahead, believed that Greece should retain some of its older territories. There is a third person in the story. His name is Aristide Briand. He was at various points Prime Minister or President of the Republic. Again, an entirely different character, an entirely different personality to the other two. Aristide Briand was a pacifist. After the war, he was very much for a united Europe, probably one of the beginning protagonists of that idea of unifying Europe. Whereas, as I already said, Raymond Poincaré was on the opposite side. So between the three, there was a problem of cooperation and a problem of realizing what each thought was good for his own country. And I think this is what brings us to this very interesting fight during the Lausanne Treaty. The Treaty of Lausanne, or the Conference rather of Lausanne, was separated in three, in terms of subject of discussion, in three committees, three separate committees. One committee was about politics and about territorial distribution. The second committee was about economics in general. And the third committee was about return of territories or giving up territories that belonged to other states. These three committees more or less, I think, make up the entire discussion of who gets what throughout the discussion, throughout the conference of Lausanne. And one of the major territories given up to Turkey was the two islands of Imbros and Tenedos, which belonged to Greece before. So we have a series of returns from one to the other side.